the William Temple Foundation has a long history of engagement in public theology in Manchester as a kind of test bed for these issues that we now live with in terms of economic change, growing plurality, growing economic rich wealth as well as poverty. And I did some research back in the early 2000s looking at faith-based engagement with regeneration. It's through that research that I met people like Paul and Dwight and other people who I think names I will remember. This is going back a long way, of course. But urban theology, urban mission has always been an important part of what we do at the William Temple Foundation. And of course, Canon John Atherton, who some of you may remember, who was canon theologian at Manchester Cathedral for 30 years, taught the legendary Christian social ethics course at Manchester University. He also was a key contributor to the Faith in the City report in 1985-86. So it's very much within our DNA, and we were delighted when Greg Smith, who's one of our associate research fellows, pitched the idea of a particular specific strand of our Temple Tract series, which are these 8,000-word digital essays that explored 40 years of urban mission since the publication of the Faith in the City, well, not publication of the Faith in the City report, but 40 years of urban mission, and not only looking back, but also looking forward, taking stock of the present kind of experience of practitioners engaged at the cutting edge of urban mission, and also looking forward. So we very much hope that this evening's event will do just that. It will look backwards, if you like. It will cover the terrain of 25 years of incarnational urban mission in Manchester. But through the people that we've invited to respond, we'll look at the present experience and the legacy maybe of that work, where it's landing now, but also maybe look forward as well to the future of urban mission and theology and the role of faith in the city. So that's our Urban Tract series, which is part of the Temple Tract series, and I hope very much that you've been able to access those through our website, williamtemplefoundation.org.uk. And the person who's leading our webinar this evening is somebody who wrote one of those urban tracts, Paul. Paul Keeble wrote the second in our series, Going the Distance, 25 Years of Urban Presence. And Paul is a co-founder of Urban Presence with Derek Parnell in 1996. And he's been involved in several local organizations, ministries, churches and charities, and including national charities such as Street Pastors. So Paul is going to talk for about 20 minutes, laying out some of the arguments from that tract and anything else that he wants to bring before us. We've then got a panel of 3 respondents who I'll introduce when we get to that point, who we all hope will speak for about 7 minutes in response to the issues that they have heard from Paul and where it's landing in their own experience. Then obviously we want to leave a good 20 minutes or so at the end for general discussion and questions and discussions from the floor. And we'll do our best to finish promptly at 9 o'clock. So I hope that's okay with everyone. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Paul. Paul, over to you.
Okay, hello everybody. Good to see some familiar faces here and a few familiar names as well. Yeah, gosh. Right, I'll stop reminiscing. Right, first thing is I need to pass on apologies from Derek. He's still suffering after effects of COVID, and so he cannot join us tonight. So this passes on to you. I'll get stuck in, I think. Okay, here's the technical bit. Am I able to share a screen? I am. Wonderful. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay. It should be a bit bigger, except I managed to forget something. Some notes. Okay, you should be seeing there a first image, which is the sort of the tracks so far. I've done mine biggest because we're talking about mine tonight. It's number 2, Going the Distance, and Greg did number 1, and Sally Mann has just released Remainer Reflections, Following Jesus of Nazareth, Not Jesus of Sepphoris. I shall be coming back to that. It's very good. So this session is based on the second one, and I'm going to start by there you go, technical issues. Sorry. I've just lost the I've lost the thing to advance the slides. Let's get that back again, get it on the other screen. And off we go. Okay, this is the original picture that was used by Tim for the front of the urban tract. This is my street. This young lady still lives on the next street to mine, just round to the left. She's a bit bigger now. Going the Distance was a reflection on the 25-year life of the charity Urban Presence, number 1069404. 1996 to 2021, which I co-founded with Derek, and for most of that time was chaired by Dwight Swanson, who is here with us today. I actually dedicated Going the Distance to our long-suffering trustees, but that got lost somewhere in the edit. And part of the tract is an expanded version of a script for one of the 2 videos we made in 2020 whenever we were sort of winding things up, and you should have had links to those on the Eventbrite page. So what I'm going to do is do a quick summary of the tract, maybe picking out a few things, and then I want to zoom in on the areas of incarnation and mission. The subtitle for this is The Calling to Incarnational Urban Mission, and looking at that and calling, and the calling that lies behind our being in the inner city as an incarnational urban presence. And like Greg, both Derek and I have clocked it over 40 years. I know I don't look as old as him. Well, I'm not actually. And then the setting up of Urban Presence as the charity, so capital UP. So looking at the summary, the tract looks at why we started Urban Presence, which was around an imbalance that we perceived of where the church is, i.e. where Christians live, between urban areas and suburban areas. And we came up with this rough figure of sort of 75% of people live in urban areas, 25% live in suburban areas. It was based on census information and based on more what's the word, stories and experience. We reckoned that the church was the other way around, 75-25 the other way. And we say in the tract that our point back in 96 was, and still is, that if all Christians, to use the popular phrase, have been placed by God where they are, then given the proportion in the inner city, that imbalance would suggest that God is not that concerned with reaching the people in the inner city. And hopefully we know that's not true. Here's our original logo, which actually features the 75-25 on it. There's a bit of history for you. I won't put up the original photographs of Derek and I from 25 years ago. So continuing with this summary, there's a bit of history looking at the Manchester context, a couple of things that have sort of major changes that have happened here, and also what hasn't changed, which really is the urban context. We did a reminder of the responsibility of the whole church to take the whole gospel to the whole world. That's from the Lausanne Covenant, which includes the whole city. And we asked the question, is the church reflecting wider society and failing to take adequate responsibility for the least, the last and the lost? Or its members reflecting that division and inequality in their lifestyle and location choices? This is the imbalance Urban Presence asks the church to recognise and address. A form of levelling up, if you like. And then we took a closer look at the imbalance, the problem, being the drift of the suburbs, redemption and lift, redemption and leave, as Derek called it, and its causes, which we contend are a misplaced theology of place and flawed discipleship. I'll come back to those. So here's the Urban Presence website. This still exists. It's been remodeled a bit, and it's much smaller now. It's really a way of sort of pointing to other resources, including Greg's amazing website, which hopefully we'll mention later. And we were set up to resource Christians, churches and organisations living and working in inner city Manchester, England, and help the wider church recognise and take responsibility for the mission field on its doorstep. So the next part of the track looks does a survey really of that resourcing work, things that we did coming alongside, training, helping set things up, working with churches, individuals, organisations. The track then looks more closely at the other side, the recognition part of urban ministry within the wider church, and that's something I felt that we had neglected a bit to reflect on. Partly because it was a task we found frustrating, and we were warned about this by people who had retired hurt before us. So we tended not to go there, and that's something that you do with things that are painful or where there would be a tendency to get overcritical or bitter or induce sympathy. So trying hard to avoid those traps, I wrote about the suburban church, suburban or wider church and the inner city. So the urban-suburban dynamic. And this might be the bit that Dwight was referring to when I noticed a comment on Facebook where he said about going the distance, Paul takes the gloves off to speak directly to suburban churches and mission leaders about, well, read it. Tantalizing. I'm not going to go into detail on that unless it comes up later. If you want to ask questions, that's fine. Except to say that the provisional title for going a distance was Robust Feedback, which was recalling Derek's forthright responses in some of our meetings with suburban churches, leaders and organisations. The non-local church relating to the inner city could be summed up as well-meaning but inappropriate at best. And this tract, which I found a couple of streets away a couple of years ago, I guess sort of sums it up for me. A well-meaning group of Christians who meet a couple of streets away, none of whom live here, and this is a multicultural area, so there's all sorts of things wrong with giving out stuff like this around here, in my opinion. They're no doubt sincere, they're well-meaning, but it's inappropriate. Then looked at the notion of distance, using a physical distance, mission from a distance, and my image for that is a certain young footballer called David Beckham, who in the same year Urban Presence began, scored a goal from his own half by taking a very long shot against Wimbledon. It's a famous incident. You can find the film on YouTube. And that to me sort of pictured away a lot of well-meaning, again, outreach is like taking shots from a long distance, from a safe distance, and occasionally one goes in. And I'm sure there's a more efficient way of doing outreach than that. Then looking at cultural distance and asking questions about whose culture. Are there assumptions of superiority? Are there blind spots? Laurie Green says it's all too easy to enter into a deprived area or culture expecting to introduce God into the place of mission, and in fact introducing only an alien gentrified culture. So continuing the summary, there's a short section on visiting them to us, because not many did, and a longer section on visiting us to them, which were stories of us trying to engage with the wider church and organisations on the whole area of urban mission, which could be summed up as politely kept at a distance. More detail in the tract. And then there was a case study on that, and a couple of distance deliberations based on interactions between the urban context and wider church in Manchester. But I'm going to focus on, for the rest of this, the calling to incarnational urban mission. So looking at incarnational first of all, And those of you who've heard me speak before will know the answer to this, but what's the most important word in theology? It's with, according to Sam Wells. It's the bit that comes in the middle of God with us, Emmanuel. And he makes a very good case for this being this linking word, linking us with God through Jesus as being the most important word in theology. Sam defines 3 ways of engaging with others: working for, working with, and being with. And he then points out that in the life of Jesus, he spent a week working for us in Jerusalem, doing what we couldn't, achieving our salvation, and this was preceded by 3 ministry years working with us, calling people to follow and work alongside him. But before that, he spent 30 years in Nazareth being with us, setting aside his plans and his strategies, his vision, I guess, and experiencing in his own body not just the exile and oppression of his people, but also the joys and sorrows of family and community life. 30 years. It's 90% of his life, 10% working with or for. And Sam asked the question, with our fixation on doing and activity and roles, do we tend to get this emphasis the other way around? As the Father sent Jesus, so he sends us. And this, I would contend, is a better fit with the great commandment, love your neighbour as yourself. Neighbour in Greek just meaning close ones. So urban presence would talk about the crucial importance of location, being incarnationally close to those we seek to love, serve and reach in Jesus' name, and long-term going the distance as opposed to short-term episodic mission or ministry from a distance. We believe that calling to inner-city ministry has a lot to do with the incarnational model of Jesus, who moved into the neighbourhood, removing that distance, and this is what urban presence was about. So looking at calling next, whatever happened to where. In her tract, Sally compares Nazareth, a small village, with nearby Sepphoris, which is the capital of Galilee, about 4 miles away, and points out that there is no record in the Gospels of Jesus ministering there. And she writes this. In John 1:46, Nathanael asks, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" The church has often echoed this jaded rhetoric, if not always in its official line on inner-city mission, then certainly in the ministry decisions of most of its trained leaders. The gravitational pull is to the Sepphoris communities, which offer greater comfort, are already better resourced, and might present an opening at the tables of the powerful. Nazareth is more about sitting on benches. Philip North, when he addressed General Synod in 2013, talked about the 2.5 years it took to fill a vacancy in an estate in Hartlepool versus 123 applications for a rich parish in Paddington in London. Church Times survey in 2014 showed far longer vacancy times and far fewer applicants for Anglican churches in the north and in inner city or housing estate parishes. And in case you think I'm just having a go at the Anglicans, a study of Methodist ministers showed 6% living in the bottom fifth of most deprived postcodes. So that's the leaders. So what are the leaders teaching? Tom Sine, and if you know me, you know I will inevitably mention Tom Sine at least once. He asks if we have allowed modernity and Western culture instead of biblical faith to shape the aspirations and values that drive our lives. Life decision number 1 for followers of Jesus is discovering how God wants to use our lives to be a part of God's living conspiracy. Then we make all the other important life decisions, where to work, where to live, and even whom to marry, in the light of that first decision. And you may be looking at that and thinking, well, it's a bit strong. So let's look at the call of the first disciples in Mark 1, which was they left their nets and followed him. And in doing that, they're leaving behind, here's an easy way to remember it, their vocation, their location, and their relationships. So the nets, where they were living, their family, not to be taken off to the sort of, the desert and some sort of, Qumran type thing. This was about priorities, because shortly afterwards, Peter is hosting Jesus at his house. So it's something about what comes first. The commentaries looking at Mark 1 all say stuff a bit like this. This is just one example. So compelling is the claim of Jesus upon them that all prior claims lose their validity. Their father, the hired servants, the boat, and the nets are left behind as they commit themselves in an exclusive sense to follow Jesus. C.E.B. Cranfield, in his classic Mark commentary, says his word lays hold on men's lives and asserts his right to their wholehearted and total allegiance, a right that takes priority even over the claims of kinship. This is something they sing about. All to Jesus I surrender, or this hymn, which is still in the hymns for today. Not sung very often these days. But, long ago apostles heard it by the Galilean lake, turned from home and work and family, leaving all for his dear sake. And just yesterday in my own church we sang the lines, make me a vessel, make me an offering, make me whatever you want me to be. But I don't know about you, but my practice falls a long way short of that. And I have an abiding memory of Tony Campolo last time he was in Manchester, possibly his last time in Manchester a few years ago, lustily singing I Surrender Some at a church not far from here. Tom Sign again. Many of the popular Christian teachings on discipleship are extremely narrow. They tend to limit the call to follow Jesus Christ to one small spiritual compartment of life. In all the other compartments, they unquestioningly let the culture call the shots. For example, in spite of all the popular Christian teaching about Jesus' lordship, it's commonly understood what comes first. Our careers come first. Getting our house in the suburbs comes first. Our upscale lifestyles come first. Then, with whatever time, energy, or resources are left, we can follow Christ. Some years ago I did an MPhil degree, which is what my book Mission With came out of, and as part of that I did a survey of 24 church leaders in this area, and one of the questions I asked was about the local footprint of their church, and questions about the whole redemption and lift thing. And the assumption of pretty well, maybe two exceptions of those church leaders, including leaders in the inner city, was that converted people will move away. That was just, one of them said, well, they started here and they sort of moved out. Another one said, those with get up and go, get up and do just that. And redemption and lift, of course, is all about people through their faith discovering more of their human potential and perhaps becoming people who are able to get up and go. Another one said, we encourage local involvement, but we don't ever preach about where you live. We wouldn't give any direction in that area. So that's unchallenged middle-class aspiration. And yes, there will be lots of good reasons to move, but what about calling? Is this not so much disobedience? Is it not actually being on the radar as an option? In my own church, I remember a particular family moving away just before their children reached school age, and we sort of felt an implicit criticism of us sending our kids to local schools. And around the same time, another family moved to Malawi, and their children were schooled in a village in the middle of nowhere, and they were hailed as heroes. So in our discipleship, middle-class aspiration is not being questioned, and there is a question not being asked, which is, what is the modern equivalent of left their nets and followed him? And the one commentator in Mark does ask, and he's unique in the ones I read, maybe this is a special calling for an elite few, the disciples, Paul, some modern missionaries like the family who went to Malawi. But even if that was the case, we still need to ask the question. If we got calling sorted, would the imbalance of urban-suburban fix itself, or am I being idealistic or unrealistic, even after all these years of banging away on this? And yes, there is a cost. We each have our limits, and I think God respects that and works with what we can give him. And sometimes it doesn't work out, and I do know of people who have had to leave an inner city ministry or living in an inner city area because of difficulties. And that's very hard to explain, and I can't explain it, but at least they got out of the boat and had a go. But let's ask the question. There's a story, half of which is in Mission With, because only half of it had happened at the time. A key member of our church involved in youth work and Sunday school and all sorts of things, was a teacher by training, but he was unemployed and searching for a job. And I spoke to him one day about his sense of calling, and he said, yes, I do feel called to this church and to this area, but being realistic, quote, I have to go where the jobs are. And sure enough, he moved elsewhere. Now, there's obviously calling to be a teacher has to be weighed up in there. But the second half of the story, which happened a few years later, was this same bloke fell in love. And he moved again to where his heart was, to where his fiancée was. And once there, he looked for a job. So we can do things the other way around. In terms of staying put, a couple of stories. Someone I know very well in a professional job, but living in the inner city and part of an inner city church, was offered a promotion, but this involved moving to another city. So he asked the question, and his answer was that he should stay put, and he turned the promotion down, and he's still at the same church in the local area. Someone else I know was offered a promotion to a company board, and he accepted, but he didn't move to where the other directors lived. He stayed with the church and local area, which in that case happened to be a village. So let's ask the question. I'm going to quote from Greg's tract. Even after 40 years, our fear is that most of the church, especially the white evangelical suburban church, does not get it. As a disciple of Jesus, where you live does matter, and the fact that you are white and middle class does give you privilege and a distinct worldview. There is a challenge, at least to some people, to come over and help us move in and live deep in urban communities for the long term, perhaps as a lifetime vocation. There is also a challenge for Christians born and raised in such places to stay and serve the kingdom where they are. That's something I've not actually touched on here, but I think I need to move on. Will that challenge be heard if the question not being asked doesn't get asked? Is it time for inner city churches to say, hang on a minute, let's get a few things sorted out, or are we just too tired to fight this assimilation of the prevailing culture of convenience, comfort and consumption? Is it time to challenge afresh and engage the now traditional mission thinking of the suburban churches when it comes to action on having a real heart for the poor? Well-meaning but inappropriate, occasional, sporadic, with a very clear power footprint, Beckham long shots, but sometimes long-term moving in and living deep. I'm just going to finish with a longer quote from Going the Distance. It's not that mission to people in inner city areas by means of occasional visits from a physical and cultural distance is impossible. The Holy Spirit can certainly use just about anything we offer, but mission from up close and personal, taking whatever time it takes to make relationships, earn trust, share ordinary life, listening and learning before speaking, being evangelized, small e, by our neighbours, by hearing their stories without shoehorning in our agenda, in short, being an urban presence, is surely closer to the incarnational example of Jesus, who sends us as the Father sent him. Even when done sensitively, if such mission from outside results in new Christians with an inbuilt aspiration to assume the middle-class culture of their mentors, rather than work out their faith in their own culture, then the inevitable redemption and lift/leave will occur. The best possible neighbour witness to fellow residents will be lost, and the left-behind community will be impacted by a further blow to their self-esteem. Could that money and time be better spent in other, longer, harder, less glamorous activity with those communities? Maybe paying the salary of a much-loved church-based worker in an established community hub on an inner-city estate that cannot get further funding because it isn't a new project. And in saying that, I have someone in mind. Over to you.
Thanks, Paul, very much for that great presentation, which I think really pulls out the kind of tensions that you're exploring in your tract, the push and pull between staying and leaving, and what does incarnational ministry really require, and taking a long, hard look, I think, after 25 years of being with, and alongside asking, questions about where we are now, those of you, us, who are in very provocative questions to develop and to build upon with our the rest of our panel, which I'll introduce in a moment. Just to say that Ryan has put up in the chat the resources, some of the resources that Paul was referring to, including Greg's Urban Mission Portal, which Paul referred to, which is an outstanding resource. And Greg, I'm not going to ask you to talk about it now, but at the end, if that's okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes just to give a very quick. So, Greg will talk about that. But I would like to now invite our three panelists to respond from their own thoughts and experience that Paul has shared with us. And again, Paul, thank you so much for that. So first off is Dwight Swanson, who describes himself as a Mancunian of more than 40 years. He is a Senior Research Fellow in Biblical Studies at Nazarene Theological College and Honorary Fellow of the Centre for Biblical Studies at the University of Manchester. So Dwight, thank you for joining us this evening, and your 7 minutes starts now. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. It's really hard to figure out how to do 7 minutes in response to Paul. By way of a preface, I think I had been reading William Temple's Christianity and Social Order not so long ago again, and was struck by the fact that it's still far too pertinent today and could have been written in our time, but has conclusions that need to be brought into the 21st century. I have been an urban presence trustee since 1998. I had to really search through my piles of files to remember when that was. So most of the life of urban presence working with Derek and Paul, and became chair in about 2005. I can't even find that little piece of information yet. And have, as I mentioned in other places, I think lived as a neighbor with Paul, neighboring communities, neighboring parishes in Manchester. And so we've talked about a lot of the things that are in that booklet quite frequently over that period of time. And it's been a focus of my own attention. Also, I made mention in one of my posts to try to get people in was Paul's book, Mission With, which comes out of his years of ministry and urban presence. And it's which I consider to be a very insightful theological reflection on inner urban Manchester, which is of use beyond Manchester itself. And as I read read this booklet, the Urban Tract, as alongside it, that's what I expressed this sense that this is the gloves off, or part of that, the other side of that story, which was ironic and biting and winsome. I think this is, to the point, trying to get to the suburban church, the greater church, to mission leaders, to listen. It sort of expresses our 40 years of trying to speak up for the needs of the city, and so often just if not being ignored, being politely received and dismissed. That's just so often the case where it is. And so I wouldn't make no apologies or for that sense, but when you read that, just read it again and again. Some of the things which Paul just very obliquely and politely referred to, even as he was speaking this evening. Derek and Paul have been a part, I think, of just about any and every urban initiative that has taken place in Manchester in this past 40 years. You name something that you know about, somewhere lurking in there is one or the other of these two fellows. And they have provided resources, they've provided training, they've provided support and advice and insight. And the urban presence is sometimes offered as an umbrella organization for groups to start up, such as Urban Action. I one time counted up, we went to over 20 urban initiatives that have taken place over that period of time that have had a significant help from Paul and Derek to find their way through what is the city of Manchester. So I commend both of these books to you, and to hear the cry of the suburban church. One thing that, I didn't keep track of when I started, so now I don't know when to finish. The other, let me know, Chris. So
you're good for another 5 minutes.
Right.
5 minutes, Dwight.
So let me speak of a couple of points then to the book in particular. One is that the theology of place, the importance of that, the incarnational ministry. When I first came to Manchester, I had a strong sense that I was being called to urban ministry, urban mission. I had not lived in an urban setting in my life. I came from a relatively small town in the United States, and in fact, I was a pastor of a church in a village of 300 just prior to coming to Manchester. So it was quite a shock to the system to come, but that was my calling, and then I had to find out what that meant, I guess. And it took probably 4 or 5 years to get beyond just not liking the city, right? Strong dislike for city life, and that was my theology of the city at that time was largely affected by people like Jacques Ellul, whose meaning of the city portrays the city as distinct from God, as distanced from God, and in a rebellion against God. But as time goes on, I discovered that I rather began to like being in the city itself, but also found myself, as it were, at home. And part of that came out of a point where I had to decide, I said, okay, how does a church grow in the inner city? Because that's what it's all about, is growing churches, isn't it? And the church saw no spectacular growth. It held its own and was engaged in the community, but there was no great growth. And we actually once considered the possibility that maybe what we would need to do was to become focused on an ethnic group, one of the ethnic groups within our church, and just become a single, a homogeneous church unit, as the church growth people would call it. And the church affirmed at that point that no, we are a diverse congregation. We represent a variety of the diversity of our community, and to affirm that as our strength and to go with it. And that gave a peace, I think, to me, so that by the time after 10 years here, I found myself going to teach at a Nazarene college in Switzerland, suffering for Jesus in the Alps, that our children came with us. We'd been there a few months when we're living in this, again, a very small community of only a few thousand outside of Schaffhausen on the River Rhine, that we were traveling through Zurich and with a family, and as we went right through the middle of the city, our kids were rolling down the windows in the back, and they're going, smell the city. They missed the odors of the city, and we realized that sort of gets into your blood system, and that's what's needed for the city. You can't parachute in, and that's one of the biggest problems that Paul is addressing here, is the tendency of evangelical groups, churches, who have a heart for the city, who have a longing to help in the city and see that God is going to use them to save the city. I could number on hands and feet probably the number of people, groups over these years, who have come in telling us, God has sent us here. He's given us a vision for this place, and this is what we're going to do. Sometimes, maybe once, they would say, talk to us. They would get us together to say, this is what we're planning to do. And then, and then they would say, but if you don't do it with us, we'll do it anyway. And then they would go on and do it anyway. Or more often, and this continues to be the case, come in very almost next door to us, but not even knock on our door and say, let's talk about what we're trying to do, as though nothing's going on in the city. Well, there's a lot that God is doing in the city, and if because I've run out of my time so rapidly on this, I just want to see, the positive thing about the church in the city is that when it is your life, when you become a part of a community, when the opportunity for the church is there to incarnate what it means to be the body of Christ. And it's the sort of thing that Paul says on page 56 of his book. I will just come back to the love of neighbor. That's what it's all about. After 40 years, 50 years of ministry, I tell with all the initials that are behind my name academically, or I can put them there if I want to. I have to just tell students, you've got to just love people. If you don't love people, there's no use even starting trying to do something. It's about loving people. Paul says, what if we don't start with projects and programs to connect with and help the deprived and marginalized, but find that we are helping them simply because they are our neighbors? What if the church was a demonstration of what it means to be human in the world and in everyday life? Or I would say a human community, a community of faith that lives and practices in the midst of whatever life gives us, but sparking with the grace and love of God as a foretaste of the kingdom of shalom, peace, justice, and equality. I would love to see lots of people join in that sort of effort.
Thank you, Dwight, very much. Some really great insights there for us to think about, and some very vividly drawn examples as well. So thank you very much for that. It's my great pleasure now to introduce our second panelist, Anna Whitfield. Anna is placement manager / community development course lead and lecturer at Nazarene Theological College in Manchester. Anna, it's lovely to see you. Thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you, it's a privilege. I wanted to start by saying that I love what Paul has written, and when you're reading something, you slightly feel like you're preaching to the converted, because all the way through I'm going, yes, Paul, preach, brother, and I was getting really excited with myself, and really helpfully some of the arguments that Paul made in this tract track alongside, I guess, the evolution and the journey, to use an overused phrase, I've been on too. So half my life and 95% of my Christian life has been spent in Manchester, in Wythenshawe and in Denton now for 14 years. And very soon after I'd become a Christian, I moved to Wythenshawe to become part of something called Eden. And Paul mentions this in terms of the shape of incarnational, the shaping of missiology in ways that are more incarnational. And I was 23, totally green, utterly naive. And one of the phrases that Paul uses repeatedly is, I had my heart in the right place. But over the last 23, 24 years, the pennies dropping have moved me emotionally, geographically, and theologically, and I think I absolutely see the world in a different way, and I'm entirely grateful for those engagements, and the ways that was my formative years. Those are really formative years for me as a Christian. That was my hardcore discipleship was going on in those spaces of living in a community. And I wasn't raised in the church, I hadn't done youth ministry, any of those things. So I haven't had any experiences of, in some ways, that idea of parachuting in. I hadn't, that hadn't been my experience. Within a year of being a Christian, I was living in a council estate in the middle of South Manchester. And there was a point that came pretty early on where I was faced with some really challenging circumstances with some of the young people that I really loved. And I knew that I needed some training because I felt ill-equipped. And that led me on a journey to be much more involved with youth and community work more professionally. But I think what was at the heart of it, it reminded me of what we've been talking about this evening, and it felt like I needed a framework. I needed my theology to help me understand some of the woundedness and the joy and the mess that I was engaging with on my doorstep. And I think Sally Manners just put a really helpful comment in the chat, because I feel, similarly to Sally mentioning, that so much of what we're talking about is also about discipleship, is the way that we are shaped. And one of the things that excited me as a new-ish Christian was this sense of how can I be countercultural. I had been so excited to become a Christian and to see the world in a new way. And Paul quotes Shane Claiborne, and he says, "Commitment to a people and a place is one of the countercultural values at the heart of the gospel." And I wanted that. I didn't want to be entertained. I wanted to have an adventure. But I realized that that thing that, well, what's my motivation here? Why am I engaged in incarnational urban ministry? Is it about me? Is it to do with my sense of saviour complex? And those are painful journeys to go on, and I'm still on them. But I think I'm more comfortable with my discomfort. And so I know this is somewhat autobiographical, and I don't want to make it all about me, but I guess it's just helpful to consider how much of this resonates when these questions about what's going on with brothers and sisters in Christ and our engagement in proximate ways in urban settings, you know, what's going on here and how do I need to hold the mirror up to myself? I was thinking about this evening, thinking, are we all a little bit preaching to the converted? If we've chosen to be on the Zoom, might we already kind of be persuaded that this is part of what it means, that's part of the job description of living out a gospel that transforms, is about looking at, well, where are most people and how do we engage with that in ways that help and not hurt? And so I was really challenged to think, well, how is this story told in different settings in ways that draw other people into a conversation, and how can I do that in ways that don't sugarcoat, that don't oversimplify the complexity of some of the mess of life that we track alongside. And I think that's a particularly practical challenge that I find about how do I enter into spaces and draw people around the table having conversations about why is this important. And for me, I mean, I work at a theological college, you'd expect me to say this, but it is a theological position to take. It's about understanding what is our missional mandate. And is it just the verbal proclamation of an offer, a beautiful offer of salvation? Or is that idea of salvation broader? What does it mean to seek the shalom, to seek the goodness, to seek the well-being of our city? That great Jeremiah verse. And I haven't got all the answers. I've barely got any answers. I think I was at a Red Letter Christians UK book club the other night, and Sally was talking about her book, Looking for Lydia. And it really struck me as Sally was sharing her journey in East London, that Sally repeatedly would say, look, this is what God has called me to do. He didn't call me to do this. This is what he called me to do. And that sense in which our own personal lives, our family lives, track along with the places that we live. And so I moved pretty much from being a youth worker to being a children's worker when I had my own children. And the spaces that in my community, in Denton particularly, that I found myself in was my kids' local primary school. And I am utterly changed by my proximity to my fellow Dentonians, the richness, the way that they see things differently, the challenges, the disagreements, the way that they have been moved and shaped around by reorganisation in our sort of, we're like a satellite town in Denton. What's happened when, you know, brownfield sites has been turned into housing really fast, and the schools haven't been able to keep up, and so now we've got too many kids in the classes. The ways that my neighbours respond to that shapes my whole theology. It shapes my whole understanding of who I am in Christ and who they are in God's widest, beautiful picture of the redemption of all creation. And I am enormously grateful for living where I live year after year. And I think I'm just constantly struck by the ways that I see church in the broadest sense respond to proximity, for want of a better word, in ways that I recognise in myself from previous versions of my life, I think. And I think I find myself increasingly wanting to be louder and more strident, to ensure that stories of people get told, that you know, what platforms do we have, and how can those stories be amplified in our church gatherings, and more broadly, what does it end up looking like? What does church end up looking like to make space for the stories that can really shape us? And so I guess I would commend the Paul's work and what's been happening with all the urban presence and charisma, and so many of the things that have utterly shaped me in my time in Manchester. And I'm going to stop there before I start waffling even more.
Thanks, Anna. Again, some great personal reflections, and you know, outlining your own journey. And I really like the two questions you ended up there. You know, what platforms do we have for letting stories be told, and how are we as a church shaped by those stories, and do we let ourselves be really shaped by them? So thank you very much for those insights. It's now my pleasure to introduce our final panelist for this evening, and she is Lizzie Basford, who is Regional Mentor for the Poverty Truth Network and Living Well Programmes Manager, and she blogs at inpursuitofjoy.co.uk. Lizzie, thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I love the little blurb that was given about me. Someone must have Googled my name to find out that some of those things, I think. I wanted to give a little bit of context as well. So let me tell you a bit of my story as well. I grew up in a deprived part of Stoke-on-Trent. My mum and dad got saved in their early 20s. My dad had a bit of a miraculous kind of healing, really, from a drug addiction, and as a result, my mum was so blown away that she became a Christian too. But I left home when I was 18, and I headed for the South Coast for university. My student accommodation was holiday houses that you know, we would have to leave for the summer, so the holiday makers could come in and move in for the summer, and I had stunning sea views. And we'd only been able to go on a couple of holidays growing up. We didn't have a lot of money. I was one of 7, and my dad had been made redundant. And actually, I think without realizing it, we grew up without a lot of money. And my mum and dad struggled along. And if it wasn't for the generosity of people around us and sacks of potatoes being delivered to the door, I don't think we'd have managed very well. But not long after university, I got a job working in Littlehampton for a community organisation that was working in this kind of small pocket of deprivation on a council estate. And I started taking along some of the young people to my church, my very cool, trendy church, and was really discouraged when at the end of church, I would want to take these young people to McDonald's, and nobody wanted to come with me because everyone wanted to go to the pub. And I guess that was the beginning of me recognizing that not everybody kind of saw things in the same way that I did. And it wasn't long later when I heard about Eden teams in Manchester, and the way that kind of all these young people were moving into the inner city to share their lives and Jesus with those around them. And I wanted in. I was single. I wanted to be part of a team. I didn't want to be doing it on my own. And I recognized already that loving people well is hard and it's sacrificial. And so I moved to Manchester. I left the seaside and moved to Manchester. And that was 20 years ago this year, actually. And a few years later, I met my husband, and we've got 3 kids, and we are bringing them up in still the same little area of Openshaw where I moved to all that time ago. We are blessed with a garden, and I've got an allotment where I've been digging this evening, and we've got amazing neighbours and friends all around us, and we really love where we live. The community spirit is really special, and there's a richness in where we live. But it's only when I go on holiday or we visit friends and family outside of Openshaw that I kind of realise that the life choices that we've made are quite different from other people's. We, like Paul said, have seen many friends kind of move here for a short time and then decide when they've started to have children to move out to nicer places for better schools. And, you know, that's been really hard. I feel like every time somebody's moved away, I've had to choose to stay again. And that's been really challenging. I currently lead a kind of the community team for a voluntary sector organisation, which is just down the road. And we're trying to create a safe and really welcoming space for people in our local community. We welcome asylum seekers and refugees from all over the world. We had a conversation club where there was up to like 20 different nationalities of people who came along, desperate for friendship and to be cared for and loved. And we welcome in the lonely, and we stand alongside people as they are navigating kind of life, struggling against poverty and mental health problems, and just the consequences of childhood abuse and domestic violence, and many other challenges that people face. And I also work for the Poverty Truth Network, which you may know a little bit about. And a little while ago, I facilitated the Poverty Truth Commission in Manchester with some colleagues, and that's an incredible privilege to have been able to work with people and create space and opportunity for people with lived experience of poverty to share their story with the decision makers in the city. And suddenly I find myself in this position of sitting in a very fragile way, I think, at the table where they're Manchester are coming up with their next anti-poverty strategy. And you know, I'm able to speak into the fact that we need to have people with lived experience involved in what that strategy looks like. I genuinely feel really privileged to share my life with people in the community that I'm in. Every person I know and meet just through living here and through work has such an important story to share. And I long for my neighbours and my friends to experience the love of Jesus. I long for my community to know the freedom that the gospel brings and offers. And I'm still working out how to share my life and Jesus with those around me in a way that isn't just shouting at people, because I'm so desperate for people to know Jesus and to meet Jesus, and I've, you know, like Anna, I think in the beginning I think I mistook myself for the Saviour, and now I've learned that I really am not the Saviour, and I can only point towards him. Sorry, I'm being told to hurry up. I'm really encouraged by Paul's tract that he's written. Part of it made me want to weep, because so much of it resonates with my own experiences. You know, the sadness that I feel when people kind of pat me on the back for following my calling, but would never personally consider moving to an area like mine. My husband wrote a blog back in 2017 called Preferring the Poor, the retailer that beats all church denominations. And it may not come as a surprise to you that Bright House, the rent-to-own retailer, has got more than 270 stores across the country, prioritising sites in the most deprived areas. You know, Bright House prioritises poor areas in a way that surpasses the Salvation Army. And Tom writes that although we might not want to model the church on Bright House, and they do understand that the most vulnerable, poorest communities can't travel to church, so they go to the people. You know, if you're on job seekers allowance, it's unlikely that you're going to want to spend 1/10 of your money on a bus ticket to church. If the church is going to take seriously the Bible's call to take care of the poor, then we have to love people who are different to us, and that love involves sacrifice. And I listened to a Tim Keller preach recently, he talked about the purpose of work being so that we can earn more money, so that we can give it away to the poor. We can give more away, and I find this so deeply challenging. But there is, you know, Paul asked that question: are wealthy churches financially supporting struggling churches in the inner city? Keller reminds in this preach that loving the poor is as essential to the Christian faith as going to church, as worship, as prayer, as evangelism. We do need to teach this as part of discipleship. I totally agreed with the tract where it said that we somehow miss this out, that you know, we think of that as the last thing. It's a bit of an add-on if that's what you fancy. We know that Jesus was mighty in word and deed. He didn't just preach, he loved people, he healed people. Felt needs are helped by deeds, by actions. You know, even as a challenge to those who live in places like Openshaw, where I live, we can easily live in a deprived area but not really engage with anyone outside our Christian bubble. So there's a challenge that to me, to those in my community, to are we really engaging with and loving and walking alongside the people in our communities. That's it.
Thank you, Lizzie, very much for, again, you know, reacting very personally, but also very profoundly theologically and strategically with what Paul was writing in his tract. So we've had lots of personal resonances, lots of challenges, lots of ideas, lots of shared experiences.